narrowing your thesis statement. This is potentially the most important step of the process, and potentially one that you shouldn't do last, but one that you should do almost between every step, to make sure that first it's narrow and then make sure it's important and arguable, or make sure that it's arguable and then make sure it's narrow enough. Because if it's not, you've got this big, huge thesis that there's no way that you can argue in the space that you've been given. Whether you're writing a 20-page paper, a 5-page paper, a 1-page paper, or a book, you have to figure out how much you can bite off and how much you'll actually be able to discuss in that amount of space. And so for the mini essays that we are typically writing here, and for longer essays that you'll write, you need to think about exactly what you can say in the space provided, okay? So that you're not just saying something without proving it, you're actually proving it, going back to that idea of every thesis needs an essay. So in a lot of cases, if your thesis is too big, you're just going to say it and then never argue it. And that's the other really important thing about a thesis, is that you actually have to prove it and explore it. So I'm starting out off with the thesis statements that I had before that are really, really big still. This whole idea of Disney princesses, unrealistic body types, role models, sexualizing girls is huge, way too big for me to explore and prove, probably even in a 5-page paper, let alone a 1-page paper. And I'm probably going to have to revise even more later. Then here again, this idea that of holidays and family connection and commercialization and the suicide rate, really, really big. I'm going to need a lot of research and a lot of argument to go into that. And then here again, like I'm looking at violence and nonviolent change in all of human history. That's a huge, way too much for me to deal with. So is peer pressure and autonomy, way too big to deal with in a single page. So how can we actually figure out how much you can say in a page? I think that the easiest thing to do is think about the one small specific example that you're going to use, and also focusing only on one part of the source piece or one part of the topic that you're looking at, and making sure that you're not saying something general about those things, but rather tying them together, and those two things actually show up in your thesis statement so that it's clear that I'm only talking about these particular things. It might also help to consider what your expertise is. Can you talk about violence in all of human history, or can you consider what it might mean in terms of a particular cult classic movie like Star Wars or something like that, or even much, much smaller, one episode or one character within that. So consider what your expertise is and what you can say about that thing in order to be able to make a concrete argument. Another way to look at it is to take a look at the paper that you've already written and find out what you've actually said and proved, because often it isn't the whole big thing. It's something much, 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 much smaller. So this is a continual revision thing that you have to do. It's not just one step and then you're done. When you actually want to argue something and say something, and that's the whole point of writing, is to communicate and to argue and to convince and to persuade, in this case. So it's continually revising that for language, for argument, for narrowness, etc. So let's see what we might be able to do. And you'll notice that these thesis statements look absolutely nothing like they did before, because they had to be significantly narrowed. So this, the Disney one now focuses on one specific character. It focuses on, and the arguable part, considers her ethnicity, but also her unrealistic body type. And then also now I'm just going to apply it to the negative body image in 1st to 3rd grade girls, and one statistic that exists there. And even this might end up being too big for a one-page mini essay, but it certainly limits it severely from what I had before about all of the Disney princesses and all of body image issues, and the sexualization of girls. So it's narrowing it significantly. This still might be a 3 to 5 page paper. We might have to narrow the thesis even more, but it gets us closer. And then here again, I've made it specific just to one specific example that I'm dealing with and one specific commercialization. So specifically Pillsbury advertisements, and the idea of the Miller family Thanksgiving, and crescent rolls. So a very, very specific example, where I can argue that this is an important thing, and then at the end I can apply it to a much bigger issue. So the importance may not be as patently obvious or as explicit in this one. So I would probably, again, like I said, this is not just a step 1, step 2, step 3. It's kind of cyclical, and you have to keep going back and massaging until you get the right one. So while this is narrow, it may not be important enough right now. And so here's some of those student examples where I'm making sure that I'm including Malcolm X and the specific things, because both of these originally came from the Malcolm X pieces. So instead of saying something big about the world, I'm saying something specific that came from Malcolm X, and then specifically narrowing it, the first one to private school students and exactly how they might approach it. Again, probably still too big, but I'm getting closer. And then the next one says, okay, I'm going to talk about just how Malcolm X and his use of that peer connection applies to alcohol abuse in teenagers. So much narrower, again, still potentially too big. So I may have to do this a couple more times until I get the right one. And so here's the key is to really think through only what you're able to prove. So if you can't prove it in a page, then please revise that thesis until you get to a place where you can, and keep going through that cycle over and over again so that you have something real, concrete, and important to say and to argue. And again, you don't have to use the specific formulas that we've given, but connecting those concrete, specific, small things is going to make a big, big difference in making sure that your thesis says what you say that it's going to actually do.